There are several important considerations for teachers to know when assessing language learners, and this can depend on the type of assessment, whether it's a standardized state assessment or a teacher-created assessment. But what's important for both of these assessments is understanding the history of the language learner. And this should be a consideration that is looked at with the whole class and each learner as an individual. So, cultural differences is a big thing, and considering the prior schooling experiences of the child. Students coming from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different countries don't have the same experience in school as they might in the United States. So, the first thing to consider about assessment is if it's something that the students are used to and in what format are they used to that assessment. For a teacher-made assessment, it's important to keep in mind that you should eliminate cultural bias. For example, talking about holidays and traditions that might be well known in the United States, for example, Thanksgiving or Halloween. Those are things that students from other backgrounds might not be familiar with, so that's not something to include when assessing language learners. However, of course, it can be included in a statewide assessment or an assessment that you're mandated to give, whether or not you want to. So that's when it's important to consider the learner's cultural background so that you, as the teacher, are able to help them to work through those scenarios, dig out the most important parts of the question. But of course, eliminating cultural bias is best practice whenever possible. For all language learners, especially newcomers, it's so important to consider that learner's native language abilities. So as you're assessing reading comprehension, for example, if you're giving that to a child in English who speaks Russian and is a newcomer in the United States or hasn't been here for a very long time, it's important while taking that data and using it to inform your instruction to also pair that with the knowledge you have of the student's native language abilities. How is their reading comprehension in Russian? Can they decode in their home language? And then rather than looking at either of those data sets in isolation, you're putting them together to get the most out of the data, get the most out of the assessment that you're administering to these English language learners. If you have to give a standardized assessment that is in English, for example, maybe in the beginning of the year, there's a universal screener, it's given in English, you get the results, and you realize that your student is at a kindergarten level in phonics or phonological awareness or comprehension of literature or nonfiction, and they're in fourth grade. It's important to then go back and look at their comprehension in their home language, use the resources that you have available through your ESOL teacher, through the family of the child to understand, do they have deficits in those areas in their home language, or are they strong? And this is a language barrier that obviously is going to happen when a student comes to a new country. With all assessment that's administered, there's going to be data, and from that data, there's going to be assumptions or inferences that are made based on the student performance. So validity is one of the most important things about assessment, whether you're creating the assessment or not, considering its validity, considering how accurate it is, making sure as the teacher that students are familiar with the language of instruction and the language of the content, and that it is aligned with the standards so that when you're assessing language learners, the results from the data are more accurate. Assessment can be stressful for all learners, especially students who don't speak English as their first language. So it's critical that the assessment is absolutely tied to classroom instruction. So like so many of our learners, when you're assessing these language learners, it's so important to get a picture of the whole child, to understand their cultural differences, to understand their prior educational experience and their history, and make sure that the assessment is valid and reliable so that the data that we get from that assessment is actually meaningful and can be used to inform really strong instruction. There are lots of other assessments besides multiple choice tests that teachers can use to find out what students know and can do. And it's important to understand how teachers can use their assessments to determine their next steps in instruction. One type of assessment that can often be used in the beginning of the year is a universal screener. And while a universal screener does include multiple choice questions at times, it can also include open-ended questions, short answer questions, matching questions, listening questions. And basically, what a universal screener assessment does is identifies the students who are at risk in either reading or math based on the grade level standards in those subjects. And when you use this data, you can use it as a baseline in the beginning of the year to get an idea combined with other data sources of how and where you can start with students individually and in groups. And you can also use these tests as mid-year benchmarks and end-of-year assessments as well to see the growth for more general areas of reading and math. Something that teachers use daily that's not an informal, or not rather a multiple choice test, is an informal assessment. And there's lots of ways that teachers can do this and already do this in their classrooms on a daily basis. So observations and oral interviews during small group instruction, whether that's in a math workshop or with a guided reading group or maybe one-on-one with a student, this is a great way to gather data and assess students. Teachers can also use anecdotal notes, and again, that can be during whole group, independent work, small group, when they're taking notes about their observations. So much happens in our day-to-day lives as teachers, so it's important to document that with those anecdotal notes so that when you're looking back, you can reflect on the data and on the changes that students have made. You have something solid to look at with those notes. If you're taking notes and there's targeted skills that you're looking for example, if you're working with a group on vocabulary, maybe you're looking for the ability to define the word, the ability to use the word in a sentence, maybe even the ability to spell the word. Those are all things that you might include on a checklist to make your anecdotal notes even more specific. And then as you gather the data on that checklist day by day, it's really easy to put that data together and see any trends or patterns in student performance in that small group setting. Again, these types of assessments are used daily and they're really informal, but it's worth it to take the time to document so that the data can really come to life and be analyzed. Even when a child is making growth, it's harder to see if we're not documenting that. So anecdotal notes and documentation are really important, even when our observations are informal. Performance-based assessments are a really great way to assess students in a way that's not multiple choice because it gives them a little bit more creativity and flexibility with how they show their understanding of the content material. So a performance assessment allows students to demonstrate their knowledge in a specific standard or area or unit of study by producing something or completing some type of task. So again, that gives students some flexibility with how they demonstrate their knowledge. It's important as a collaborative team or an individual, if you're working alone, to make sure that you create a rubric for an assessment like this that reflects exactly what you're looking for so that when you're looking at something that's a little bit more open-ended, you still can clearly see whether or not the student understood the learning goal, the objective, or the standard. Similar to a performance-based assessment would be a math task. And sometimes even with math tasks, rather than grading for the accuracy of the answer, sometimes it's important to assess the student's ability to show their thinking, to make their thinking visible, to back up their answer. So that way they still have the opportunity to receive a higher score, even if they're not getting the correct answer because they're making their thinking visible, they're still doing that skill of communicating mathematically. A task is a good way to get students to show their understanding when maybe there's multiple correct answers. Or instead of having one correct answer, one way of doing something, they have the option to show their work in a variety of creative ways depending on the type of learner that they are. Tasks, performance-based assessments, anything that's open-ended, whether it's short answer responses or long form written responses, essays, should always be, again, graded with that rubric. And the rubric should be fine-tuned and really specific to the standards and objectives that you're assessing so that you're able to get clear data from that assessment, even if it's not a traditional multiple choice assessment where the answers are very cut and dry. A great way to assess students and also keep them accountable and in charge of their learning is by having them create portfolios. And there's a lot of different ways that teachers can go about this, and this can be short-term or longer term, but basically finding a way to break down the standards and having students collecting their own work samples that show their best work, that demonstrate their knowledge of that standard. And since students are involved in a process like a portfolio, this can really help them to understand their glows and their grows, what they have a really good grasp on and what they still need to work on. And having that understanding could make them more motivated to work towards a goal. With older learners, peer evaluations are also an option for assessment as long as it's done very carefully and students have really clear directions. With any assessment, the whole purpose is to, again, gauge student understanding and collect that data, evaluate the data that you receive, and use evidence-based strategies to take next steps, whether that is intervention or enrichment, and whether that intervention or enrichment is one-on-one, small group, whole group. Instruction should always be informed by the data. It's important that teachers use a variety of assessments. That's going to help them get a picture of the whole child, and it's going to help them get a more clear understanding of the learner in different modalities. Just giving all multiple choice tests isn't giving all learners a chance to shine where their strengths are. Just like giving all performance-based assessments isn't going to necessarily get all students to shine. So it's important to gather different types of assessments, different types of data, synthesize all of that data together to make informed decisions about instruction. Sometimes it's whole group reteaching, sometimes it's a small amount of students that need small group time working towards a certain standard. Whatever you choose to do, it's necessary to have those assessments in place to make sure that they are curated very carefully, and to make sure that you use the data from the assessments to determine next steps and inform instruction. Standardized language proficiency tests like WIDA are simply not enough to determine where to begin teaching language learners, and there are a lot of other kinds of assessments that are needed in order to get that full picture of the learner. There's so many reasons why the standardized language proficiency tests like WIDA aren't enough. A lot of them are really basic. The testing environment. A lot of times with the WIDA test, the students are pulled into a different environment, a different classroom with a teacher who they might not necessarily know, who might be a complete stranger to them, in a room where there are distractions because it's not the environment that they're familiar with. More importantly, the test doesn't take into consideration the history of the learner. that child's prior educational experiences, their cultural background, their comprehension and literacy skills in their home language, what their home language even is. There are just so many factors that make those assessments simply not accessible enough to our English language learners, especially newcomers. Like many tests, it simply creates test taking anxiety for students, and it's one piece of data that shouldn't inform a student's placement in total. Just the students' lack of English literacy is the first problem, and probably the biggest problem with these standardized assessments, because it doesn't give us enough information about where to begin with students. It doesn't take into consideration where they are in their home language. That's the most important place to start, knowing students' literacy skills that they have in their home language. So much of this information can be found out from just parent communication and interviews with students, assessment that is much more informal. So it's important, instead of just using WIDA for student placement, to use a combination of both informal and formal assessment. Multiple choice questions can be effective to understand a student's placement. Adaptive tests can be effective so that we can see on a scale how far students are able to go and sort of place them. But again, those should all be taken into consideration with all of these other pieces of data. So in the beginning of the year, while it may be appropriate to use a WIDA test, that should also be used with maybe a universal screener, maybe a DRA, developmental reading assessment, where a student can take an assessment at the kindergarten level, even if they're a fourth grader, to understand where their literacy is. A developmental spelling assessment to see where they are in their phonetic awareness, in their phonological awareness. And even though not considered a traditional assessment, just building a relationship with a student and getting to know the student and talking with them about their experiences, and along with speaking with their family members about their experiences, is really going to inform where to begin teaching those learners. If possible, gathering data from the student's previous school, even if it's another country, attempting to reach out through your school to get that information, working with a translator to better understand that information, is going to help you understand the learner and know a good starting point for them. And even with all of this assessment data, multiple different assessments, a lot of times finding a starting point with an English language learner can be trial and error. As long as the data is informing decisions, it's okay to move backwards, to move forwards, to meet the learner where they are day by day.